Hello everyone, my name's Nick Erickson. I'm the Registrar here at the Grout Museum District in Waterloo, Iowa. I'm going to begin with our collection of First World War painted helmets. We'll look at the helmets themselves, the people who own them, what they decided to paint on the helmets and why, and we'll look at the clues they left behind to help us interpret them. For this first video, we're just going to examine the basic helmet that American service members wore in the First World War. First thing we need to understand is that when the First World War began in 1914, no army is wearing helmets, right? They're wearing cloth caps or helmets, right? So the German spiked helmet, the Pickelhaube, that's actually a boiled leather shell. It's covered in a cloth cover, so it has no protective qualities whatsoever. There's no metal on it. Well, there's like a brass crest on the front underneath the cloth, right? By the time 1915 rolls around, all the armies on both sides are looking for a solution. The British looked backwards in time to the Middle Ages, to a piece of headgear called the Kettle hat, a metal helmet worn by knights and foot soldiers, I think starting in maybe the 13th century. Basic, shallow design to protect the head from shrapnel bursts, air bursts mostly. It's not to protect from bullets. Anyway, this is the design they come up with right here. It was designed in 1915, I said, by a guy named John L. Brodie. Consequently, it's called Brodie's helmet, or the Brodie helmet. The Brodie helmet is tested in 1915. The first 4,500 or so are stamped from a single piece of mild steel. So after some testings determined the mild steel wasn't good enough, and that the rim of the helmet was too sharp. So they redesigned it. They called it the Brodie Mk1. That's what we have here, which is stamped out of a single piece of hardened manganese steel with an attached mild steel rim around the edge here. It's sort of crimped on and then spot welded, usually in the back. Ours is right here, kind of on the side. So a fun side effect of that manganese steel is that, well, the shell is not magnetic, the rim is. Now when America enters the war in 1917, when they arrive over in Europe, American troops are all issued these British helmets. Soon there are a couple of deficiencies that the American War Department wants to correct, and so in 1917, the American Model 1917 helmet is devised. There are a couple of different ways to tell the difference between American-issued Brodie helmets and American-made Model 1917 helmets. In this museum's collection, we have a lot of First World War helmets, excluding the painted helmet collection. Representation is about a 50-50 split between these two helmets. Okay, so the differences. When the British made their helmets, after they were made in the factory, they were painted with a apple green, I think is what they called it, paint that was mixed with sand, and it was brushed on. American helmets were dipped in these great vats of OD green paint, olive drab green, and then sawdust was blown using fans on the over the helmet while the paint was still wet. If you put the helmets side by side, there's a noticeable difference between the applied gravel paint and the blown sawdust on the American helmets. And also the American helmets tend to have a flatter coat of paint on them because they were dunked, right? Whereas the British helmets are going to show a lot of brush strokes on them. Another difference is the chin strap bail on the inside of the helmet is affixed to the brim of the helmet on the British Brodie helmet with a split rivet. The Americans found that to be a little too weak, so they replaced that in their design with it's like a normal rivet, and I'm not actually sure what they're called. And then the last big noticeable difference is this isn't present on every single British helmet, right? But it's on a lot of them. There's a rubber donut just inside the crown of the helmet that's supposed to seat it better on the top of the wearer's head and provide a little extra comfort. It's right underneath the felt pad that's usually found at most of the top of the inside of the crowns of these helmets. And that was never present on any American helmet. Now, one last difference between the two types of helmets I'd like to talk about is I've never actually read it anywhere else, so it might just be a fluke, but on average, the helmets in our collection, the Brodie helmets are about a half an inch wider than the Model 1917s. Now, like I said, that could be a fluke. They're old, they got beat up in the war, they were sometimes mishandled after the war, sometimes the brims are bent and warped, and so maybe that's just an anomaly. The last thing I want to examine in this here first video is I want to take a closer look at the standard paint job that was given to the Brodie helmet and the Model 1917 right here, the reasons behind it. This is a series about painted First World War helmets anyhow, so let's look at the standard paint job. For a contrast, I have over here on your left this super shiny Model 1917. It was actually part of the uniform for the local Becker-Chapman American Legion Post 138 in the 1920s. I realize this is a rather stark contrast, but I'm hoping it'll help to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So, why green, right? Now, most armies in this period, they're choosing different colors. The Americans settle on olive drab green. The British settle on what they call khaki, which is a little different than how we think of khaki today. It certainly is a more brown than the tan color that we think of when we think of khakis now. And so that's just, they're hoping that it'll blend into the environment. Makes perfect sense. We take it for granted now because we tend to think of, that's like army colors as green, right? Dark colors absorb light. So this is super shiny, so it's going to reflect a lot of light. This is dark, it absorbs it. You don't want the enemy to spot you on the battlefield. So why the sawdust? Why the sand, right? Well, this is a very flat surface, so when light hits it, the light, almost all of the light, bounces right back. Not straight back from the direction it came, but pretty close to it. It goes right into your eyeball. You can see this from way off. If you make the surface rough or jagged, like the sawdust or the sand does on these painted helmets over here, when the light hits the helmet, it bounces off all of those little angles in there in 1,000 different directions and sort of disperses. And not a lot of it makes it back to your eye. It's harder to see it, right? It makes it less shiny, it makes it more dull. Now, some of these old World War I helmets have sort of a tendency, and we'll see that in future videos, to be kind of shiny today. And that's 100 years of handling. People have touched it, they've sort of worn smooth, and they're getting a little more shiny. That actually happened during the war as well. The American Model 1917, the sawdust in the paint tended to, with a lot of handling, compress and flatten, and so it wouldn't deflect the light in as many different directions, and the helmets would get shinier. That's why you see a lot of American helmets nowadays. The sawdust paint has been brushed over, usually by like supply depots behind the lines during the First World War. It's been brushed over with a sand paint, just like those British ones. So they'll show signs of brushstrokes, and it'll be an American M1917. Okay. Thank you very, very much for watching. I'm looking forward to producing a few more of these over the coming weeks. Stay tuned. My name is Nick Erickson, Registrar for the Grout Museum District in Waterloo, signing off.